Many of you may know the story of Harold and the Purple Crayon. I think it's one of those stories that I read to my children quite frequently, trying to make them young, aspiring architects. And it's great in that we each get to sort of plan our own environment. At a very young age, I think we all become urban planners in some aspect, whether it be playing with Legos, playing with blocks. We reconfigure them and create them in a way where we define our own urban environment. And really, in the end, that's what makes architecture inspiring. That's what gets us motivated. That's what gets us going every day to deal with the clients and the difficulties that exist in everyday design. So at night, every night, Harold goes to sleep and he dreams and visions the world that he's left behind. And I think that's what we try to bring to this idea of domestic life. Our firm has been around for about 11 years. We've really cut our teeth in residential architecture. Many would attest it's a difficult part of our profession in that we deal with clients that are very demanding and very detail-oriented and occupy probably 1/1,000,000th of the building that Gordon just showed us, which gets an intense amount of design into that. Architecture itself it affects the built environment. We oftentimes like to think about how we can create a balance between our designs, no matter what their scale is, and how they sit in the environment, and how we can begin to understand the materiality, the balance of nature and space between indoors and outdoors, and how we can really begin to deal with this idea of filtered light. Many of you in the room probably live in Chicago if you live in an urban environment. This idea of how we were able to bring the outside in and create transparency and texture and definition is something that's very relevant, whether you're dealing with a living space, a bathroom space, or even a townhouse that may exist within the urban environment. For us, the idea of transparency and screening is our way of making connection from the inside to out. And it allows us to create a level of privacy from the homeowners and users so that it becomes a more pleasant space to be in. And that's relevant both on the urban scale and on a rural scale, as you see here. And it can be seen on many different levels. It doesn't matter if it's a home or just a small entry lobby. This idea of filtered light and bringing it into the space is something that we're very passionate about. Additionally, and I think many of us in this profession, and I think many of the previous lectures really talk about this idea of technology and fabrication and an understanding of product and how we can interpret that into the space. These are renderings of a project that's under construction now and how we're fabricating and really perforating and filtering the vision from the user of the home from inside to outside, and then seeing it executed on a different scale and how we're literally taking that nature and fabricating it into the architecture, into the surfaces that we're molding and blending into the space. And then just again, how the space, using this idea of texture, materials, and bringing them together in a home, and then looking at a home and how we can create it and break it down, much like in some of the previous images, how we can compartmentalize our living spaces into the individual programs that exist within them, and then how we can interpret that onto a larger scale. This was an ideas project that we contemplated just so we could understand how the ideas of materiality, programmatic components could be explored on a larger scale in an urban environment, and then that's what led us into the project in New Orleans. Hurricane Rita and Katrina, I think, had a profound effect on many of us in this country. The images that we've seen from there have become something that we're all sort of immune to today. I mean, the events that have recently happened in Japan, in Haiti, the tornadoes in this country have really just almost hardened us to this idea of destruction of architecture. And I think as young, 6 years ago, when we were a bit younger than we were now, really trying to gain an understanding of how we could make our mark in architecture, when you see the level of destruction that happened to the built environment, you need to somehow react. And certainly the path of Katrina and Rita and what they did to New Orleans was something that I don't think any of us could have ever understood. The relevance of this slide, and I'll try to get the pointer out to explain to everybody who's not that familiar with New Orleans, This is Lake Pontchartrain. This is the Mississippi River coming down through here, and everything that's inside of the red line was essentially areas that flooded. Everything outside of that was what's considered the higher ground, and pre-World War II, those are the only areas of the city that were occupied. But this idea of density, this idea of infill in urban areas, was done irresponsibly. Dredging occurred, and irresponsible movement of land occurred, and houses were built in the very low-lying areas. And these were the sorts of images that we're faced with. And they're still today sort of mind-numbing to look at. And like I said before, we see them quite frequently again because there appears to be every year another natural disaster that happens. Initially, we submitted for a competition that was sponsored by Tulane University in Architectural Record. It was an ideas competition. And as a young practice, the way you sort of move out of one typology of work into another is by submitting to competitions and putting your best foot forward. This was called High Density on High Ground. It was a way to re-envision the way we could live along the edge of the Mississippi River on the earthen levee. And it dealt with a lot of these ideas of elevated green spaces and compartmentalized living conditions and green space parks that bordered the edge. And then Matt and I were fortunate enough we were one of the winners of that competition, and it brought us down to New Orleans, and these were the images we were faced with. And we didn't know what to make of them because they existed on every single block. And we felt that we needed to do more. There had to be something else we could do. We're architects, we didn't have deep enough pockets to write checks, so we felt as though we could donate our services. And that was when the competition was announced that was sponsored by Brad Pitt and Global Green, and we decided that we had invested all this energy in the previous one that we felt like it was a good opportunity for us to do this. The goal of the competition was to re-envision the development of an urban block and see how we could rebuild it for many of the characteristics that the previous speakers outlined, achieving net zero energy, incorporation of water efficiency, going for LEED Platinum, and really making a conscious outreach to the community. And doing all of this, integrating the best systems and performance characteristics of homes that could exist on an affordable level. And that was the real challenge of the project, how we could reconcile this idea of sustainability and affordability. Today, I think it's a far easier thing to do than it was then, but even 6 years ago, it was very difficult to contemplate on a smaller scale. Our initial approach, we decided to look at a master plan of the Holy Cross neighborhood, which bordered the earthen levee on the Mississippi, and see how we could rethink the way the urban blocks existed. They were, for the most part, completely devastated, except for the areas along the levee itself, and we realized that we didn't have an understanding of who was going to come back, how many people there was going to be, and how they were going to utilize these plots of land. So we created these green corridors that would really filter people and bring them out to the levee itself. And we defined what we termed this idea of an educational transect. If our urban block was to be a beacon for people to come to, we wanted to design it in such a way that it drew people to the site so that they could not only live there, work there, and play there, but they could also become knowledgeable about the practices that we were implementing. So they would filter their way through the site and make their way out into the earthen levee over this bridge that connect over the road, and it would be just a great connection point to that area. The program was to have originally 6 single-family homes, a community center, business incubation space, a daycare center, and an 18-unit apartment building. And it was created as a 2-part competition. So the initial part was there were 7 finalists that were selected. We went down to New Orleans. We had several meetings and presentations with community groups that were the few people that were on the ground making their way back to New Orleans. And they really inspired and created a lot of the ideas and direction for all of the competitors' projects. We really took an in-depth look at the typologies of homes that existed in New Orleans. There were shotgun camelback houses, very long, narrow structures that dealt with this idea of passive air cooling and front porches, and just really varied that scale and came up with what we called sort of a new progressive vernacularism for the New Orleans area.